The American Civil War is without a doubt one of the most complicated wars ever fought. Fought between the years of 1861 and 1865, this war has been in our history books for all the right and wrong reasons: slavery, segregation based on race, and of course the sheer amount of people who lost their lives on both sides. But there's a very terrifying incident which happened right after the war ended, and for some weird reason, it has become one of the least talked about American tragedies. The Titanic wreck in 1912 is considered to be one of the worst maritime accidents in history. But did you know that a similar tragedy occurred over 45 years earlier, killing even more people than the unsinkable ship? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's meet the Sultana Steamboat. Just like its successor, the Sultana Steamboat was considered to be ahead of its time. Built out of wood in 1863 by John Lithbury Bochart, the steamboat was a major transportation vehicle. Regularly, the steamboat operated in the New Orleans cotton trade, but since the Civil War was also on at the time, the steamer also transported soldiers between New Orleans and St. Louis. Just a year later, the owner sold off the boat to a certain James Cass Mason, whose ingenious idea turned around the fortune of the steamboat. The cotton trade was not at its best, so steamboats owners had to find a creative way to make money, and this resulted in a steamboat transportation boom. But with so many steamboats around, it was impossible to make so much money. So in 1865, Captain Mason set out on a trip upriver and ended up setting the record for the fastest steamboat at the time. Fortunately, to honor this record, the Sultana was given a set of elk's antlers to symbolize how fast it was. Like a natural businessman, Captain Mason placed the antlers right at the center of the boat for everyone to see, eventually making the Sultana a popular choice among travelers. But the Sultana's popularity would eventually lead to its premature demise. In late April 1865, the Civil War finally ended, and thousands of soldiers, mostly released Union soldiers, could now go home. And since it's been used a couple of times in the past, the Sultana was an evident choice. The soldiers were happy. They had survived a long, dreary and bloody war. They had endured disease-ridden detention camps, loss of their fellow countrymen and friends, but it was all over, and it was finally time to go home. 2,100 paroled soldiers were eventually allowed to board the Sultana, and by the time the steamboat pulled away from the docks at Vicksburg, Mississippi, it had a total of 2,300 people on board. For starters, this steamboat was legally around to carry just over 350 people, but Captain Mason's greed had gotten the better part of him. At the dock, Mason meets Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, who proposes a deal to him. Captain Hatch assured Mason that he could get at least 1,400 men on his steamboat for $2,500, which will be around $40,000 today, and all Hatch was asking for in return was a kickback. It was good business for both men, so why not? But things got a little complicated when the released Union prisoners had to board the Sultana. Some sort of mix-up happened, and the Union officer in charge of the boarding decided it was best to put every released soldier on one steamboat. This would have counted as a great idea if only the officer in charge knew the correct number of soldiers. By the time the boat was fully loaded, it had almost 2,000 paroled soldiers, 70 fare-paying passengers, 85 crew members, and 22 soldiers from the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. For 2 days, the boat groaned and creaked its way to the north, and the floods in the river was making the journey unbearable for the passengers. On the 26th of April, the steamboat arrived in Memphis around 7 p.m., and after a few items were removed and over 200 soldiers dropped off, Sultana continued its journey northward. However, just 2 hours past midnight, the first tragedy will strike, and only after a few seconds, 2 more will resound. The steamboat's boilers had just exploded, and hundreds of men were caught in the debris and damage caused by the explosions. In fact, the explosions were so violent that they tore through the pilot house and the decks, killing hundreds of men and the steamboat's pilots in a matter of seconds. Now that the captain and a large number of the crew members were dead, the steamboat began to drift and burn. The ship was in chaos and on fire. Fortunately, 30 minutes after the explosion, another steamboat, the Bostona, arrived and was able to rescue the surviving passengers. The Sultana, on the other hand, will eventually sink completely by 7 a.m. in the morning, recording an estimated 1,700 deaths, with only about 700 survivors. As soon as this story hit the news, most people claimed that there was something bigger at play here. Apparently, Captain Mason had taken the steamboat out for a leaky boiler repair right before the trip. The mechanic advised that a ruptured seam had to be cut out and replaced, and Mason knew that such repair would take over 2 days. Not wanting to lose the good deal he just got, he instructed the mechanic to make something temporary for the trip, promising to be back as soon as possible. But why did this tragic story never get the attention it deserved? Well, it happened at a very tricky time in American history. The Civil War had just ended. President Abraham Lincoln had died 2 weeks earlier, and his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, had been captured and killed. Also, it had become too common to read about mass deaths in the papers, so by the time the Sultana story hit the papers, most people were too overwhelmed with the political problems of their day, rather than 1,700 people who had died in a single night. But if you think the story somehow gets better after this, think again. In a weird twist of events, nobody eventually got punished for what was an avoidable accident. Captain Mason had died in the wreck, and Captain Hatch, who brought the dirty deal to Mason, retired right after the war so he could avoid getting a court-martial. And how about the captain who ordered every single soldier on that boat? Well, the military weren't going to pin this down on one of their own men. Quite the tragic story, right? The Sultana disaster remains the most deadly maritime disaster in the US history, and it sure deserves a whole lot more recognition than it gets. Enjoyed this video? Subscribe to get more content like this. See you next time.